You're listening to the Native Plants Healthy Planet podcast, presented by Pinelands Nursery. Here are your hosts, Fran Chismar and Tom Knezik.
Welcome back to the Native Plants Healthy Planet podcast presented by Pinelands Nursery. I am Fran Chismar.
And I'm Tom Knezik. Welcome to episode 82.
And we've already been sidetracked before we even started recording.
So it's good we got it out of the way so we don't have to get sidetracked now.
Oh, we're getting sidetracked.
But on our last, or I guess it was episode 80, not our last episode, but episode 80, we talked about green roofs.
Yes.
And how to use native plants in those capacities. Well, there's other types of green infrastructure that are a little bit unique and almost like cutting edge technology. You think native plants have been around forever, but there's cutting edge technology that's going into utilizing these plants in green infrastructure.
Yeah, and you know, the funny thing is we deal with it. Our plants help supply these things, and I'm aware of the technology, but I really don't know the ins and outs of it. Like I know of it, I know basic applications, but I should probably know more considering how much of our material gets used for this. And some of these are so cutting edge, and we've seen so many different variants of them moving forward that they're becoming more and more. There's a big difference in how often these things we see now than we did 5 years ago.
Yeah, definitely. And that's important because we've mentioned before, we're running out of space. So it's time to get creative. And that's where rooftops come into play. That's what used to be impervious surface. We can make it so it actually has a benefit using native plants. And there's another area, and that's on top of the water that we can use native plants. So that's where we're going to get into our guest. And I'm going to introduce Jack. Thumb over my for the first couple of Szczepanski. Did I get it okay?
All right.
Yes,
All right.
sir. I like it.
I am notorious for mispronouncing even the easiest of last names. So, which is interesting because I don't have an easy to pronounce last name either.
No,
But
your last name gets when people call that don't know you, your last name gets mispronounced. I don't know that I've ever had anyone pronounce it correctly on the first try.
well, it defies the English language. So
Yeah.
that's why.
That's always great for a name, isn't it?
Yeah. But
And I can totally
Jack,
appreciate that.
Yeah, Jack, why don't you go into more depth than I will about introducing yourself and telling us a little about who you work for.
So I am Jack Szczepanski. I'm with Princeton Hydro. I'm a senior project manager and senior aquatic ecologist with the aquatics division. We do a lot with pond and lake management, water quality improvements. We do a lot of great work with water resources. But my company also does a lot of everything from design to an implementation of engineering as well. So not just trying to clean up the water within the water, but also to take things further and build things and do engineering to do ecological uplift at the water's edge and above in the watershed as well.
I know there's other companies out there that do this, but I think it's pretty unique. Princeton Hydro is a pretty unique company in that that's what the focus is and how in depth it is. Like I said, there's other people that dabble in it. Maybe there's other people that do it as well, but I don't know that there's anyone that kind of does it the way that Princeton Hydro does it. And obviously we've had a relationship for going back quite a while, but for our listeners that don't know who Princeton Hydro is, can you tell us a little bit about the history of Princeton Hydro?
Yeah, sure. So I'd say a little over 20 years ago, because we just hit our 20-year mark. I feel like I should know this. About a year or so ago, pandemic has kind of turned me into being in a time warp at this point. But about 20 years ago, Mark Gallagher, Jeff Gall, and Steve Souza, they started a company that was focused on management and restoration of water resources. Now, they were employed by a small company called Coastal Environmental Services, and it ended up getting bought out by a larger company. And they weren't really into that big company. They didn't fit into that big company mold. If you've ever met any of these gentlemen, you would understand. And most of the rest of my colleagues in my company, yeah, we don't fit into that big company mold. So they decided to kind of start a company with a mission that was a little bit more true to the environmental roots and consistent with their moral compass. And they founded Princeton Hydro. Company started growing, and eventually the main office that was in central New Jersey, initially in Lambertville, then moved to Ringo's because we needed more space. An office opened in eastern Pennsylvania in Exton. There's now an office in Connecticut as well, and in Maryland, and in South Jersey as well, down in like the Turnersville area, Sicklerville. And so there was a lot of work to be done in terms of, again, like I said, water quality improvement, review of engineering to make sure it was environmentally sound, being able to help out doing things like wetland delineations and understanding environmental impacts of developments. And then that just kind of expanded from there. And we've done a lot with helping not just private landowners, but also with environmental commissions, municipal governments, state governments, and even we do a lot of work with federal government projects as well. Big groups like the Nature Conservancy, all the way down to, like I said, little municipal environmental commissions to help them maybe retrofit a stormwater basin.
Awesome. I know we deal with Princeton Hydro directly sometimes, but it's amazing to me how many projects we're involved in that we find out later was a Princeton Hydro project. Even though we didn't deal with you directly, it's like, oh, I had no idea we were dealing with this person, and all of a sudden they mentioned Princeton Hydro, and that comes up more often than I can count, probably, which is it's pretty cool to have your thumbprint on so many different things and projects in the area.
Yeah, I like that as well. So I've been with the company for about 4 years now. And I had briefly heard about Princeton Hydro in some of my other capacities, but then as kind of working with Princeton Hydro and then going to like conferences or meetings or something, and meeting somebody or seeing somebody that I had worked with, say, oh, we know Princeton Hydro. Oh yeah, like, oh wow, okay, awesome.
And how did you wind up at Princeton Hydro?
So I was working with the U.S. federal government in Cape May National Wildlife Refuge as a Hurricane Sandy restoration biologist. Okay. And Fred, I think I may have actually met you when I was working with them before I came to Princeton Hydro at the Partnership for Delaware Estuaries Environmental Summit.
Yes.
And I think because that refuge in particular does, get plans for restoration work from you guys. And has a fantastic relationship. So to take a couple steps back, I had been teaching with a private school out in the Hamptons. I was teaching marine ecology, and right out of college, right out of grad school, I just got my doctorate, and actually gotten in touch with Steve Souza, and he said, you know what, get a little bit more experience before you come to our company. We would like to see, I mentioned to him that I was like, oh, I see you're looking for a wetland ecologist. I do wetland work. He said, I like your credentials, but I think you need more experience. I went to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and was a project manager on a couple of restoration projects that were funded by Hurricane Sandy funding. And that got me a lot more acclimated to working with contractors, consultants, and managing larger projects like that. And so a couple of years into my term with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, funding ended up getting exhausted a little bit sooner than they anticipated. And it just worked out that Princeton Hydro was still looking for somebody at that time. And I had the experience that they were looking for, and I needed the position, and it just seemed to work out really well.
That's great.
It's amazing the amount of good that comes out of tragedy. Like you mentioned Hurricane Sandy, and it's weird for us that a lot of our business is based on tragedy. It's someone did something they shouldn't have done, or a natural disaster like Hurricane Sandy, or
Well, and I think a lot of it's just the realization that we probably should have done this a long time ago.
Yeah.
And
it's righting the wrongs.
it's easy to know that you need home insurance after you have something that happens and you aren't covered. And this was a similar situation with Hurricane Sandy, where we realized that our coastlines weren't covered, and it was like, oh, we got to invest in this.
Yeah.
But the really smart people were doing that when it wasn't in vogue.
But it's amazing what comes out of it, the work that gets done. Like you realize, oh, our infrastructure is not great. We need to, this may be once in 100 years, but look at the damage it caused. We need to make sure the next time this doesn't happen, or the technology that comes out of it, or just the way of thinking of, we need to do this. How are we going to do it? It's just, it's to me, it's amazing for how horrible of an event that was, the great things that came out of it as we've progressed. Because it just makes you think a little bit differently, or makes you think a different way about what needs to get done and how it needs to get done. But speaking of which, like projects, I know we're going to, we want to talk about floating wetland islands and technology of getting things done, how to get done. But what are some of the other projects? I know you kind of briefly mentioned it, that Princeton Hydro gets involved with, other than floating wetland islands.
Right. So we do design, we do permitting, we do the implementation as well of upgrading stormwater management systems. We do wetland and stream restorations. One of the big ones I'm starting to try to get a little bit more involved with are dam removals. We have a really great group that has done a number of dam removals throughout New Jersey, Connecticut, some in Pennsylvania, New York. And that has been actually really good for the fish community and fish passage. That's aquatic connectivity. And it's one of the things in my background, because a lot of my education and some of my training is involved with fish biology. And so that's I haven't been able to really kind of merge that yet with the folks in our company that do the dam removals, but I'm starting to try to really get that get involved with that. But our company does a really great job with all that. We've assisted with sediment dredging. So, taking a lake or a pond or a water body that needs a little bit more depth, and removing accumulated sediment that's coming from outside the watershed and kind of over time filling it up. That the accumulation of sediment tends to, it has negative impacts when it comes to dissolved oxygen levels, the amount of space for habitat and stuff like that. So that's particularly important. But we also, something that isn't necessarily, it's not one of our main, so yeah, take that part out. Coastal protection, coastal work is something we're really getting into. We've had a number of projects that work with taking gray hard infrastructure and turning it a little bit more green. Like living shorelines is a big deal. That's some of this green infrastructure we're talking about. Connecting floodplains back to their original connectivity. They had been cut off at some point or another by some sort of barrier, and reconnecting them so that there's more of a natural progression across seasons between a dry time of the year and a wet time of the year for the different plant communities, and being able to have the right kind of habitat because of where it is in the water course. But again, yeah, we like to be able to do things that turn things a little bit more naturalized, and going more towards the green infrastructure into things to address climate resilience.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Tom, I'm going to sidetrack us I swear, because I have a question and I don't know where
it's
it
okay
fits.
because I was going to do it.
All right, I don't know where it fits, but before we get into the meat of what we want to talk about, in not experience, but in your tenure, what's the worst case scenario project that you've seen that has been restored? Like what was the one project you stepped on and you were like, I can't believe this is that bad, or was allowed to get this bad, and I'm proud that we're getting to fix this?
That's a really good question, because I'll tell you what, I don't feel like I've been a part of some of the more engineering heavy projects that dealt with that. Now, there are a number of projects that I know that we've done that involve, again, increasing aquatic connectivity, taking down a dam. There's a number of dams on the Musconetcong River. And those are the ones that I think that I have touched a little bit, done a little bit of some of the monitoring of some of the aquatic species, like the invertebrates and the macroinvertebrates and some of the fish. And I was able to get my hands on that a little bit. But seeing the improvement after the dam has been removed, seeing what it looks like beforehand from some of the pictures, and it's just remarkable. Knowing that prior to our involvement, the Musconetcong River had not seen American shad for over 250 years.
Wow.
Because of the dams. And knowing that soon after some of our dam removal, folks were catching American shad in the Musconetcong River. So that one, especially as a somebody who has a background in fish biology, that was really something. Like I said, I can't say anything other than remarkable.
I love that you brought that up, because that project has probably come up. This is the third time on the podcast.
Say, I'm glad you brought that up, because that was how I was going to sidetrack us and say that it came up in
the Nature Conservancy.
I recall it was episode 25 with the Nature Conservancy,
with Michelle de Blasio.
I'm pretty sure we talked about it in episode 28 with Russ Fenari with CWRP,
because
and then again in episode 54 with Joe Cermelli from Meat Eater.
Yeah.
And so that's a project that's come up a lot, and that was another one until Fran was bringing up all the places we've seen Princeton Hydro kind of tied in. I was like, oh yeah, that was another one where I saw it all. I'm like, oh yeah, Princeton Hydro was tied into that too. So
yeah, it's funny. Some of the ones that that pop up, you see the design plan and our little logo right here. It pops up at the bottom, like, oh, we did do that. That's awesome. And there's still a lot of work to be done on the Musconetcong, but it's going in the right direction, and that'll definitely be the one of the top ones in my mind when more of those dams come down and we're able to see a lot more occupying habitat from these native species that haven't been there. I know this is a plant podcast, but fish.
No, it's, we love to say it's a plant podcast, but it's really an ecology podcast at heart.
Yeah, it's all
that talks about native plants.
Because realistically, the plants are the thing that kind of ties everything together. And we've brought it up too many times to count. How we started this podcast was because so many people were had their own interests, but they all were rooted in native plants. If you wanted to be more successful at hunting or fishing, if you had better habitat coming from native plants, that was really, really helpful. If you wanted
you put your tree stand under the oak
or birds or all that kind of stuff, you needed native plants to make that successful. So it was really just to kind of unite a lot of these groups that had different end goals, but had a common path to reach those end goals. So
in my teaching, I was one of the big things I tried to push with my students was that everything, aside from surface area to volume ratio is the answer to almost all of life's questions. Everything is part of a system, and every system has lots of little parts to consider. And, a lot of the things that we do for our water resource and improvements there involve plants, but it also involves the fish. It's the entire system. And we take it from the watershed. We like take solving problems upstream and doing it in the watershed before it gets to the lake, before it gets to the pond, before it gets to the ocean. But again, it's because each of these parts, of which the native plants are a very important part, are critical to the success of the entire system.
You know, before this podcast, it's something that I never said, but I think it in problem solving at least once a week is, how does it affect the food web? And that's something that I never connected to what I was doing, even though it's such a big part. And since we started this, that's like the one thing that roots me into a lot of my problem solving at this point.
Roots.
Speaking of roots, one of the things that we wanted to was that your
I was going to segue
right.
too.
I didn't want to cut you off. We wanted to really talk about green infrastructure, specifically floating wetland islands. So for our listeners that aren't familiar with this, if we could just give a basic understanding of what a floating wetland island is.
Yeah, sure. So these are the ones that we use typically, and most of them are typically large, buoyant, positively buoyant, composite fibrous mats, if you will.
Okay.
I liken them to giant Brillo pads, if you want to think of it that way. And they are oftentimes drilled with holes, but there's like they said, a very positive buoyant core, so plugging holes in them isn't going to make them sink. And the holes are where we would put plants, trying to think of the planting material, some sort of substrate for the plants to go in. And that sits above about 3 to 4 feet at minimum above the substrate of the water body, so above the sediment in a lake or a pond or something. And as the plants grow, the roots will go into the water, but not just the roots. It's the fibers of the floating mat that actually form a substrate for a biofilm. So lots of microorganisms taking up space in this giant Brillo pad with the plants, and the plants add more surface area. There it is, surface area to volume. In order for the microbes to take up more residence. These things would actually work they would still work pretty well without the plants. However, they work even better and a lot prettier when you put the plants on top too. They do a lot more with the plants on there anyway. But so as they grow, they provide habitat on top of the water. The roots and the matrix that are at the surface and under the water then provide habitat for these microbes, which then they clean up the water. The big job is improving water quality by taking up pollutants, or what we call nutrients. I mean, it sounds like a good thing, but the nutrients actually are feeding all kinds of stuff in the water, which includes harmful algae and things that will outcompete some of the more beneficial organisms, whether it's a green algae or submerged aquatic vegetation, some sort of plant that lives in the water too. So these nutrients that are free and available for the harmful algae are then taken up before they can get to the harmful algae. So things like phosphorus, nitrogen, copper, and zinc are known to be taken up by this, ammonia. So some stuff that really kind of decrease the water quality. And these islands do a really great job of removing that from the water and cleaning it up in a really relatively natural way.
In the way it should be. It's funny because simplistically for me, like whenever you see an issue where, say, you're having horrible water turbidity or something, something's out of whack, and you need to. What's the natural way of putting it back in place, which makes sense to me, and like that's on a very simplistic form. And I'm sure there's a lot of chemicals or man-made reasons why something, or impact just from local impact, that you can't change because it's already been impacted, and you're just dealing with what you have now and how do you get it back to its natural state. Is that a pretty fair assumption?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah, because one of the things that we use the floating wetland islands to deal with is non-point source pollution. And so that's stormwater runoff from anywhere. during like a rain event or something, and it's not something you can pinpoint like an outfall pipe, that's a point source. And so exactly like you're saying, it could be any number of sources that are contributing these materials into the water body that are going to be decreasing the quality. And so this is kind of like a catch-all. It's not going to solve all your problems, but it does a good job of this non-point source pollution. If you can't really say, okay, that's what this exact spot is causing the problem.
Yeah.
Now, why isn't the shoreline good enough? Why can't you just have the shoreline planted? Why do we have to go and put plants in the middle of the pond or the lake?
That's a great question. So if you put plants along the shoreline, they're just deriving nutrients from the soil. Mm-hmm. That's also why the islands have to float about 3 or 4 feet above the bottom of the water body, because if they take root, they're not taking the materials out of the water column itself. So that's kind of the important thing. And that was something when I started dealing with this, I didn't really understand it at first, because I was like, well, that'll help anchor it in. That's cool. But then the plants aren't assisting with the nutrient removal, and they do a really good job of taking out all different types of nutrients. So yeah.
Now this isn't that old of a technology, am I correct? Like 15 years ago, I don't remember hearing that much about it. Or maybe
not within the industry. So I did a little, I didn't know a whole lot about this either. Again, until I started working with Princeton Hydro and doing more green infrastructure work. I think when I was with the refuge, I had heard about them, but I didn't really delve into looking into what it was first. It wouldn't have solved the problems that we were working on in our salt marsh with subsidence and erosion and all that good stuff like that. But it turns out people have been building floating islands for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. I'm right. So there apparently were some communities, some cultures in South America and Mexico a very long time ago that tried building their cities on floating islands to stay away from like warring neighbors or something like that, tribes that are nearby that were not so friendly. But then there were also the other communities were doing this for agriculture. So they were planting some of their vegetation, some of their vegetables, and plant some of their crops. There you go. That's the word I was looking for. On these islands, kind of to protect them from getting eaten by, animals, or but also because they were in the water and they grew really well, that almost like hydroponics. Mm-hmm. And so that carried over. I think it was done with rice in Asia a little bit, and I don't know how it compares to current current rice paddies. I'm really not certain of how that works, but I do know that that there is some work funding rice agriculture to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And that actually, believe it or not, ties in with some work that I'm doing with the floating wetland islands. Our contacts and other people in my group have been talking with one of the manufacturers of these islands, and there's a lot more research going into reducing methane emissions and how much these islands, and we don't know exactly how much yet, but apparently it's cutting down on methane emissions bubbling out of lakes. I have a friend who works for EPA, and I was actually just talking with her last week about this before the holiday, and it's a considerable amount of methane. And that's it's a greenhouse gas, and it's one of these things we're very worried about in terms of accumulation in the atmosphere. So the floating wetland islands are not only removing nutrients and improving the water quality, but potentially also helping to mitigate some of our air quality issues as well. Now, again, we don't know exactly how much that's happening yet, but it's neat to think that this technology, which in the form that we're using it now, started, at least with our company, in about 2005. We've been installing them and implementing them since, I want to say one of the bigger projects we did early on was 2010. out in the Poconos. But yeah, it's really developing a lot quicker now than it had been in the past, for sure, at least in our industry. But historically, they've been around.
And we've seen like different applications where I know Rutgers Water Resource, they were doing programs to teach people how to build a floating wetland island. And there was a company it was a doctor in Spain that had come up with, do you remember this, Tom?
I don't know.
They approached us probably like 10 years ago, and it was almost like floating discs that connected together that the plants went in, but they were using it for phytoremediation as sewer treatment. And they were
Oh,
using
okay.
like cattails, just because of how quickly they would grow and how quickly they could phytoremediate water quality.
Okay.
And they were just floating these cells that would connect together over top of large areas and just letting it take it up and then harvesting the cattails and dispose. I think they were incinerating them or something like that to take the contaminants out of the water and
Sure.
cleanse it that way. And I know
Yeah.
they were doing something on Long Island, and I don't know that the technology ever successfully transitioned from Spain to here. But
Okay.
it was just weird, or it was cool seeing all at once, all these different approaches to what a floating wetland island was and how they could be used. And I really didn't know how it's, since 2010, has the technology changed? Like, has it, like, what's being used or the product that you're using, has it gotten better? Has it morphed?
Yes, it has. I think part of what's improving is the ability to construct the islands themselves. Now with our supply chain issues and our transportation issues, this may change, but the ability to carry some really large pieces of material and deliver them to a lake has improved quite a bit. But the materials themselves that form the matrix of the island has gotten better. It doesn't, in fact, even within the past couple years, between when I installed a handful of islands up at Greenwood Lake in 2020, and then a bunch of islands in Asbury Park this past year, they have added an armoring component. I think it's just an extra material, an extra coating of a certain polymer that's a lot tougher. But even between those two periods of time, it helps to extend the longevity of each of the islands, the durability of the islands. Because let's be real, you got plants there, you're going to have animals trying to nest and climb on it, birds basking on it. So they're going to be scratching and pushing. And there's turtles living in lakes, and they're going to be climbing on it in their claws. Even the action of wind bouncing, these islands, even though they're anchored, they're still going to, if you have a series of islands together, them knocking into each other, that does create stress. And so the materials have changed, therefore, like I said, increasing their durability over time, which has, the longer you can keep them intact, the more nutrient they're going to take out of the water, the better they're going to do for water quality improvement. In addition to that, there's been other technologies that have been incorporated recently that we're seeing. So there's aeration systems that have been added to these islands, whether it's like a little water circulating system on top that looks kind of like a stream going through it and then it comes off, or a bubbler system that's attached through the water column underneath of it, to increase if there's issues with dissolved oxygen below it or something like that. But again, that helps to continue the mixing of the water. Some of this material has been, you need energy for. Sorry, I'm going to turn my phone off. That was buzzing at me. I apologize.
No worries.
You need energy for stuff like that. You need energy to circulate water, to circulate air, and that typically in the past that meant you would have to have a compressor and an energy source with some kind of utility line on the shore run that out to the island. So the island would have to be close enough to the shoreline to make that feasible, or you just have a lot of utilities running into the water body to the island. Well, then you attach solar to that, and then you have it a little bit more self-sustaining. So, and it's also greener energy as well. So there's a lot of directions we can go with these. More recently, and I think this also kind of goes along with the methane reductions, is adding an element of activated charcoal, like you would in a fish tank. So in addition to the active bio matrix, the biofilm, and the matrix of the island itself, then you have this charcoal filter, which would increase the adsorption properties, the ability to uptake probably even more nutrients than the plants and the biofilms can do, even making the islands that much more effective. That part is also really cool. Again, its elegance is in its simplicity. It's just burnt wood. This is just a floating mat of composite. Ah!
Wow.
We're just figuring this out now.
Yeah, it's a lot more high tech than the one we have in our pond.
No, we have a small one in our pond, but it's a small pond. But we have, I know there's geese on it. I know there's turtles that you're constantly seeing sun themselves on it. And the plant material has even changed and evolved over time, where some have kind of had their life cycle and others have taken over more. And I want to go into the plants a little more, but I want to push that off a little bit. Just as far as application purposes go, I guess this is a multi-part question. Is there any project that is too small or too big for a floating wetland island? And some of the different types of applications, is it strictly freshwater? Can it be saltwater? Can it be brackish? Like what are some of the factors going in to determine that, hey, this body of water is a perfect candidate for a floating wetland island?
So that's a really good question. I think knowing there's water quality issues is the first start. They can be used in a lot of applications. You say, is there a water body too large or too small? Really, that's dependent on the size of the islands and how many islands you want to be able to put in there. The locations for islands, and usually it helps having some sort of cove to protect them. We've been having some challenges on one of our sets that we did in Asbury Park because there's very little shelter at all. And so some of our anchoring, our initial anchoring strategies were not working. And these floating islands were floating everywhere. They're still taking up nutrients, but at the same time, if they're floating all over the place, then they're subject to, again, the stresses of maybe bouncing into the shoreline, the walls. Then they become prone to potentially, if they get stuck in one spot and it's a shallow spot, then they'll start growing into that spot, which again, we want them floating in enough water to be able to circulate below them and take up those nutrients. So we've learned, and this kind of goes back to your other question, how things change. We've changed how we anchor those with more sturdy chains. Now, when it comes to freshwater, saltwater, that really is dependent on the types of plants. There's still nutrients in the water, and the composite island that we put in there gets colonized by whatever microorganisms, biofilms that already reside in that water body. And so saltwater microbes will be occupying an island in saltwater. If we wanted to be planting them to, again, kind of create additional habitat above the water for things like birds and smaller semi-aquatic organisms like reptiles, turtles, and stuff like that, we would need to make sure that those plants were salt tolerant plants, something native to that particular environment. But again, deep enough for water to circulate underneath. And size, I think, just so long as 1% of the water body honestly, I'm not sure there is an upper limit. You don't want to cover the entire water body with islands.
Gotcha.
So because then you're reducing the amount of sunlight that gets in and be able to help any of the plants that are, any of the native plants growing under the water already. But that's a tough question to answer.
I have a question based on ignorance, my own ignorance. So, and
Aren't they all?
they're all based on my own ignorance. Uh, when it comes to water quality issues, freshwater versus saltwater, I'm not saying that saltwater can't be like contaminated or issues, but is it really a different range of issues? Is it like, because saltwater, you're dealing with much larger bodies of water that can handle maybe certain environmental conditions differently just because of its size, but like as far as like algae bloom or fish kills or things like that, or like you've seen ponds completely covered with duckweed or something that I'm assuming, not that saltwater doesn't have issues, it's a different set of it. Maybe they're not susceptible to certain things, but I know they're getting contaminated. So
Right.
I just don't know if it's less pressure on it because it is a saline issue and that in itself takes care of certain things, or the size of the body of water. I don't know.
That being said, you still have smaller areas of saltwater when you have something like a salt pond
Okay.
that has a barrier islands creating this. You still have tidal areas. You have salt marshes and stuff where there are pans and pools that form on the tides. So you still have some small water bodies that are saltwater. You do have large lakes that are almost like oceans. So really your range of issues do tend to stem from very similar things. When you say fish kills, that's often due to low oxygen levels, and that definitely can happen in saltwater as well as freshwater. I used to see that a lot not a lot, but the issue was talked about when I was at school in Rhode Island. A friend of mine was dealing with fish kills and oxygen levels in a tributary to the Narragansett Bay. And so when that turned over, when you have areas of low mixing over the course of summer, and then your storms come, and then you have the mixing of the water, so that tends to create environments with low dissolved oxygen levels. Oxygen is taken up a lot more quickly, and so it's a lot less for the fish. So you have die-offs there, you have fish kills there, you have fish kills in freshwater as well for pretty much the same reasons. You also do have nutrients coming in, non-point source pollution coming into saltwater. When it's out in the open ocean, yes, that is a slightly different story, and you have limiting nutrients. So phosphorus, let's talk, typically, phosphorus is typically considered a limiting nutrient in freshwaters of mid-Atlantic states. And that means that the nutrient is in the shortest supply relative to biological demand. When it comes to saltwater, usually it's nitrogen, but that isn't always necessarily the case, depending on the system too. That's also a consideration as well. And again, it really depends on the water body, but more often than not, with phosphorus being a limiting nutrient in freshwaters, that's one of the things we tend to focus on when we're looking at water quality improvements and trying to understand what it is we should implement as green infrastructure. But the floating wetland islands do address both. And so I've been having discussions with a friend of mine who is trying to get them in more saline environments. But in order to justify it, he wants to be able to show his administrative folks, some of the financial people, to try to understand the cost per acre of environmental uplift, the best bang for their buck. And he wants to be able to show them the nitrogen removal rates. And that's a little bit harder to establish. Like you said, in saltwater, it is a bigger system oftentimes, at least in the environment, at least with the ones that he's working on. Those tend to be harder to pinpoint the amount of removal rates due just to the islands. So it is harder to understand, but it is something that can be taken up by these islands. So the nitrogen and the phosphorus, it can be used all over the place.
Like, I'm sure it has to do with what those bodies of waters have protecting them as well. Like when you have a bigger system, a bigger saline system, you have salt marshes that are filtering and protecting as well. You know, so I guess it depends on their defense system,
Mhm.
I guess, to say. And it's pretty interesting, and it made me think to the study that we just talked about I guess it's a couple months ago on the podcast, where they were doing studies with plastic, not intake or removal, but in salt marshes, they were able to dig cores to see like plastic use over the over the years, and how it's filtered out plastic use. And I'm wondering even if that's an application that floating islands will be able to do at some point, either if anyone's even looked at that.
Oh yeah, I wonder. I don't think it has.
Okay.
And it, like I say, even just now, are people starting to look at methane reduction because of the islands? And I feel like methane was something that's been talked about for a long time in terms of carbon inputs to the atmosphere. I remember when I was a kid, you know, cows being a major producer of methane, and a hole in the ozone layer and stuff like that. And so it's just now that even though these islands have been, made at least by the company that we get them from for, since 2005, and we're really starting to get a better hold on what kind of impact they're having on methane. So I'm kind of not surprised that we don't really know a whole lot about what the impact is relative to things like, I guess, nanoplastics. I know that's definitely certainly been a thing, especially like you were saying in the salt marshes. I know that I've seen some studies that were done on the impact of nanoplastics and things like sea cucumbers, which process the sediments and filter that stuff out. But yeah, that's definitely a thing.
Wow.
Now, and that kind of sparked another question for me, because I think one of the reasons they're able to look at the nanoplastic accumulation throughout time is because a lot of these salt marshes are, what's the right way to put it? I'm blanking on the word. Basically, they're getting deeper. They're accumulating more peat. The dead plants are then going into that soil layer, I guess.
And you have to have the age to be able to do that too.
Are these floating islands, are they doing that as well, or they just kind of maintain that same footprint? Or is that biofilm or the microbes or the plants as they die back every year, is it accumulating mass, so to speak? Biomass, or is it just kind of
I think so. Certainly not with the microbes. I mean, I don't think they're doing a whole lot to increase the mass of the island. My guess is that, and again, I could mostly because I haven't had a huge experience with the islands directly in terms of the ones that I've installed. The ones I've installed are being put in, they were put in now, they were put in last year. There is a certain amount of material that does go back, but stays on the island itself. And so future plants are going to be building on top of that, but I don't think it's a significant, I say that, and I use the word significant, and, in academia, I get, I know my advisor rolling his eyes right now. But, and then me speculating about how much I don't think it's a huge deal in terms of how much is actually accumulating. It does pretty much cover the same footprint. It doesn't expand outward a whole lot. One thing I do know is that we have seen there is enough material, or at least enough space on these islands, where we've seen trees end up growing on them that we did not plant there. Now, how big the trees are, I don't think they're like, these, ones out by the street, giant shade trees, but there are some trees on these islands.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
That's very cool.
Yeah, totally. And I guess that gets me to, it kind of segues me to my next question, which I just scribbled down, was maintenance. Once these islands are deployed and they're working, is there a lot of maintenance to be done? Does work have to be done on the plant material or upkeep to keep them functioning the way they should be functioning? Or is it a lifespan to it?
That's a really good question. Okay, so kind of as just in thinking my answer through from the last question, I think there can be enough material on top, therefore, to be able to support something like a tree. When it comes to maintenance, that's really up to whoever's responsible for it. It doesn't see, these are relatively self-sustaining. Once the plants get established, they can take care of themselves. They grow, they die back, and then they continue to grow. And again, at some point, sometimes get colonized by other plants that weren't actually intended to be on there. But then that also does bring in the question of, does the responsible party with the client, the person, whoever got the grant to get the islands in there, whoever paid for the islands and is taking care of them, do they want them to continue to look pretty? And therefore, make sure that there are flowering plants on the island all the time. And if those die back, then you replant them. That's a maintenance consideration. Do you want to continue to maintain them with native plants? So if you do, I mean, they're still substrate. So invasives and non-native species are going to want to occupy space that's available. So you're going to find invasives on there from time to time. If you really are concerned about transmission of certain invasive species, there's a certain amount of monitoring that needs to be done to say, hey, look, there's invasives, let's remove them. But if you are strictly concerned mostly with nutrient removal, then you can plant them, make sure they're planted, make sure that the plant's established, and they go on for 10 or 15 years as far as we know. And I think some of them we've seen up to 20, but I think the generally accepted lifespan of a synthetic floating wetland island, like the ones that we produce, is about 10 to 15 years.
Okay. I know we want to delve into the plant material, and something you said just sparked something else in me. Like, because I think with the floating islands, especially ours, we don't cut it back, and it's great habitat, and obviously we love native plants, and we love seeing that those plants are creating a great ecosystem and a good habitat, and they're contributing to the food web and other functions too. But I want to talk what plants are used, because those plants can live in those environments. But has there been studies done, native and non-natives, that say these plants are the best for nutrient removal? Like, native plants are great, but if you use this plant, you're actually creating better water quality. And I guess
that is a good question. And this is one of those ones I don't really have a good answer for.
Okay. All right.
That being said, in terms of which plants, if there's been studies and which plants are better for nutrient removal, that part I'm not 100% sure of. But these islands can be deployed without plants, and they still do a really good job because they provide surface area for the biofilms. I want to say the biofilm can take up to 80% of the removal of the nutrients that the island is capable of, even with plants. But I think if there are plants, that percentage can shift. So I do know they work without the plants, but which plants do better? It may even depend on the environment and which plants are best suited to that environment.
Because I'm having all kinds of weird thoughts that probably, they may make sense, they may make absolutely no sense at all, because we talk about native plants and ecosystems and what and provenance, that these plants are well adapted to these areas because they've evolved here. I don't know if it's the same for water. You know what I mean? Because water technically has living organisms in it as well. So if you were to take, empty a water source and take water from across the world and put it here, like, is it even though it's water and you think water's water, does it make a difference?
Yeah,
right,
I think it could,
right,
but yeah, we're starting to wax philosophical here. This is take that water. If you don't do anything to the water, there is going to be stuff in that water that either does better in the new water source than what's already there, or it just will die off because it can't deal with the combination of nutrients, or other compounds that weren't available in its original source. It is a habitat, and water with nothing, the strictly H2O molecule is just another substrate for some of these organisms. And so it's just habitat. I say that, but it's a way different habitat than, say, living in a tree, based on physical properties. And that's something I did my master's on. It was a thing. It was crazy. Water is crazy cool.
Yeah.
It's got so much cool stuff going on.
Because you think plants evolve with the wildlife around it, and I would imagine wetland plants have to also evolve with the water around it, the hydrology and the soil and
The nutrient load,
Yeah.
and the mineral contents and all that kind of stuff.
and when
yeah.
that changes, it affects everything. And we've talked about this
Absolutely.
before, just damming the Hackensack and the meadowlands, which were once Atlantic white cedars, everything dies off, becomes Phragmites, just because the change in the system and how it affects everything. So I'd imagine plant material somewhat has to be cognizant of that habitat.
Right. No, absolutely.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I mean,
sorry.
if you put plants in on an island that tolerate the conditions, and so they grow, they'll grow year after year, but they don't thrive. I venture to say that those plants probably wouldn't have as an efficient nutrient uptake ability as a plant that is better suited for wetland conditions, which then would probably proliferate better. And I think that's just strictly would be a result of the additional biomass that the more the plants that are better suited for that environment, they're just going to produce more biomass, more root system, more surface area for this biofilm for nutrient removal. The ones that don't do well, but still just survive, are going to be there, but they're not producing enough. They're not producing as much surface area to be able to take up these nutrients as otherwise.
And that's actually half answered what I was going to ask. And that was, we talk about the biofilm and the microbes and all that, and the plants are taking up some nutrients. Is it more so that the roots are just creating so much more surface area for those biofilms, the biofilm, and that's what's taking up nutrients? Or
A little bit of both.
Plants themselves.
Yeah, well, the plants are definitely going to be taking up the nutrients as well. But the fact that they have this root system also does provide that surface area. So that's why, the islands can work without the plants, but they really are so much better when they do have the plants, because they provide that surface area in addition to removing the nutrients for the plant, for the growth of the plants that are there too. And then they also provide that habitat. It's just so, and they're pretty.
And when we're talking about roots on the plants in these systems, how much more surface area does that create? I'm imagining something. I guess I've seen videos of what they have in the Inner Harbor in Baltimore, some of those floating islands, and how underneath it's like there's all little fish and crabs clinging, and there's all this.
I actually got to see those a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
I was in Baltimore a couple weeks ago, and one of the islands does have aeration, which I was really kind of taken with. It was cool.
I know they were doing some unique things too. I know some of the, like at one point they were doing some islands being made from like water bottles that were found in the harbor. And I don't know. I know that was a little experiment they were doing at some point. I don't know whatever happened with that, but
yeah, I can't tell you those, but I'll tell you, I think in one of the sets of islands I just did this past spring, there had been a floating island made of soda bottles. I think it was like a Boy Scout project or something. It really wasn't that great. And those, if you lose the integrity of the bottles, then they just sink and become garbage.
Yeah.
With these islands, you have this core material that I'm sure it's some kind of foam, but again, it's encased in this outer sheath of fibrous composite material, which is then reinforced with this other polymer to protect it. And you punch holes in it, this thing's not going to sink.
Yeah.
Awesome. So like we started talking about plant material, and I guess the theory behind which plant material to use, and we can get into specifics, but the plant itself isn't in water. The root system is in water, or the root system grows into water, correct?
Right.
Like there is
Yeah.
a substrate. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a plant that can sustain permanent inundation, more or less a plant that can take hydrology of, like, I would imagine like most obligate plants, obligate wetland indicator status plants would be good in an island. Like I'm
Yeah.
guessing things like iris versicolor or bulrushes, things like that, maybe
Yeah.
better suited. Is there a hit list of things that that you've typically worked with that like these plants?
Sure.
thrive
And
well?
yeah, and some of the in most of the lakes, like I said, mid-Atlantic region that we've been working in, we have, and I'm going to just use the common names. You're like you said, the blue flag iris. We got our bulrush. We put sedges in there. It was a common. I have my list over here. The common hop sedge, but I do know that we a couple of the really nice ones that are like on there, Joe Pieweed and swamp mallow, I think, swamp rose mallow. Oh, blue cardinal flower, that's a good one too.
Oh, okay.
Some of these are really nice. Those are the ones that were some of the feature plants that are on there, Asbury Park Islands, and I think that's generally what we end up having on there as well for some of the other islands I've done.
Which is interesting. Like the swamp rose mallow, I completely see. I was a little surprised with lobelia and some of the like Carrick stricta I know is an obligate, but some of these other ones are facultative wet. And it's if someone were to ask me like what would you suggest, I probably would have shied away from some of those. So it's
Right.
nice to hear that they survive well and thrive in those conditions.
Well, and again, because as you were saying, there is some of this material that builds up on top. It also doesn't necessarily need to grow straight down.
Oh,
The root system does expand outward in all, as many directions as it can. Sometimes not in this case, but some roots do go up. So, I mean, really it's just a matter of what the roots of the plants do. And so if these plants go more outward, then they're going to have water available, but they don't necessarily need to be inundated all the time.
Yeah. And when I think wetland plants, root system, for me, I think of horizontal roots because the roots don't have a need to go deep because they're only going to where the water is. And if there's a water source shallow enough for them to go, like when you're picking up the mat, are the roots, or the island, I should say, are the roots horizontal along, like creating a mat underneath the island, or are there plants that are shooting roots straight down?
There are some that go down. There are some that cut across the island as well as it comes out. And to be honest, I've never really cut into an island, so I don't know if they're through it, but I'm guessing I'm sure there's filamentous roots throughout the island itself. But I also haven't picked up an island.
Yeah.
But I've seen other images of people doing this where they have it up and it is across. It does take over quite a bit of the underside of the island, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, I mean
they're also very heavy at that point too, so picking them up is really kind of it's a rare thing.
I was trying to picture just the root system encompassed in that mat, and I was thinking it has to be woven throughout the whole thing, I would imagine. At some point, like we see when you're growing a plant in a container and you leave it in there that long and you pull it out, there's a lot more root and a lot less soil than what you started with. And I would imagine it starts displacing other things and becomes an island in itself almost.
However, unlike soil, this material isn't going to break down as easily.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think the roots themselves will do something similar, but they'll just permeate more. They'll start extending out into the water more. But they're not going to be, I know what you're talking about with they start getting root bound and stuff. And it is going to be a little bit different because they're not going to be able to break down the island as much.
So and our listeners know, that it's a good episode when Tom and I become little kids in our question asking. And it's, what if, what about this?
Which I
Right?
actually have another one right now. And is that, have you seen a project where these were so successful where there weren't enough nutrients in the water that they had to take them out?
You know that I don't, not that I know of. But I don't necessarily think that, I mean, I guess that could be the case, but it's rarely the case. Because you have nutrients coming off the watershed pretty much all the time. If you have a closed system, if you have like you still have stormwater runoff. So anytime you have a rain event, you're going to have nutrients coming from the soil around it. And a lot of the water bodies actually have a certain amount of internal loading too. So benthic material breaking down is providing nutrient in the water as well.
So when talking to you, you can see, like, you can tell that this is a subject you love, obviously.
I do.
What kind of sparked that? What led you to taking the career path that you did to get this? Like, where did that love come from?
I think it's mostly just like being outside. I love being outdoors. I love climbing trees. I love digging in the ground. I loved animals. Actually, my dream job when I was a kid was being an artist paleontologist, because I wanted to dig up dinosaur bones and then draw them. I was like, well, but they're all dead though. So then I went to trying to be more of a zoologist thing, and then I realized that there's a lot more out there, and I think I started intuitively understanding the whole system with lots of parts thing. And so a lot of my studies, I tried taking courses that took me outside, helped me understand things in the natural world around me, so that I could better grasp and better appreciate the stuff that I liked to do on my free time. So that's kind of what took me, at least in the general field of ecology. I have a very winding road of how I got here from general terrestrial ecology and being like kind of a birder and a mountain man in college to becoming much more of a marine and fisherman guy. I was working on a fishing boat, doing a demersal bottom trawl survey, catching whatever fish were in the way of the net as a baseline for a wind farm for a little while. My graduate degrees had me studying contractile properties of mussel and squid, and then looking at the diets of stingrays in Delaware Bay versus Narragansett Bay. So going then from there to teaching, and then the salt marsh restoration, and now at Princeton Hydro. I was all over the place, but in every step of the way, it was trying to better understand kind of what's happening in the natural world, what little tiny differences are going to affect the big picture, and how do we use that knowledge to improve the world we're in today.
One area I would love to do an episode on at some point is wind farming, just because for us, we're seeing what's happening, or it's supposed to happen, off the coast of Atlantic City. And I know they just approved one in Montauk also.
Yes. Yeah.
So is that something that Princeton Hydro gets involved in, at least? Because there has to be impacts as far as that goes.
Yeah, there certainly are impacts. And it's something that I want to be able to, that's something I want to take from my background and start contributing more to what Princeton Hydro does. And as of right now, I don't know of a whole lot of wind farm work that we're doing. But it certainly is something that contributes to climate resilience, and is something that, again, climate resilience is something we're really, coastal resilience especially, is something we're really interested in helping improve and get involved with. The wind project that I had worked on prior to Princeton Hydro was in Block Island Sound, so not really too far from where they're building the one or they're proposing for Montauk. I did see some information on that. Actually, when I was in Baltimore and saw the floating islands there in the inner harbor, there was a lot of discussion about the wind farms along Atlantic City, along Montauk, and what's been done so far in the Block Island Sound, and some of the stuff there. So that certainly is something that could come into play. And I'm curious to see. There's a lot of emphasis on birds, obviously, because of the blades of the turbine. There's a lot of emphasis on fish and benthic species, but I would be curious to see what kind of impact that would have for submerged vegetation. You have different stuff out there than you would in lakes and stuff, but if there's any kind of impact to various algae and seaweeds and stuff.
That's a future episode. Just
Yeah.
calling our name.
Yeah.
There you go.
So you talked about so many things you enjoy. Is there a favorite part of your job? Is there one specific aspect that you're like, man, this is, I'm always excited to get up and go out and do this, but I'm extrememely excited about this project or this part?
I'm always excited to get up and go out to do anything anymore after the pandemic, but also, this is the field work isn't something I really get a chance to do a whole lot of anymore these days. But that being said, what I do love getting involved with fish, any kind of project with fish work, because that's kind of where my background is. Being able to put in these islands has been really awesome, because honestly, they're easy to do and the results are really great, whether it is nutrient uptake or improvement of water quality, or just having these, aesthetically, these islands improve this, a lake, to have some sort of feature in the middle of the water, to be like, oh, that's really nice. But knowing that there is a lot more benefit to the water body than just aesthetic appeal. But the fish work is something that I really do enjoy, whether it's doing a survey and understanding better about the fish community in an area, or doing a fish salvage and being able to take fish in an area that the construction is happening, and being able to put them in another water body nearby, so that they don't encounter negative impacts from any kind of construction that needs to be done. Yeah, fixing like an outlet structure on a dam or floodgate or something like that.
We'll have to do a rooted discussion. Speaking of future episodes, a rooted discussion on dam removals.
Yeah.
I think that's something that we keep like flirting with as we progress through this, but we've never really gone in depth on it. Just the impacts of dams and the dam removal.
Yeah.
So
Oh yeah, especially in the plant community, you have this whole shift when you have opening up a floodplain to that was once an impoundment behind a dam, but then also looking at what's happening downstream after you remove the dam, and you have potentially greater inundation than you used to. That's fascinating. We certainly have folks that can walk you through that.
all right, well, all right, we'll do that. So we kind of, Tom, I'm sorry.
I do have one more question.
Go
but I'm
ahead.
saving it for my final thoughts.
All right, you got it. So we always kind of wrap this up with the same question, and it's a very simple question that's also very complex for most people that have ever had to answer, which is, what is your favorite native plant?
That was actually a really good one. I had to kind of think of that one for a little bit. There and then even to a point, I was like, for some of the plants that I like, I don't really think of plants a whole lot. I'm like I said, a fish guy. I was trying to think of some, and I was like, pickerel weed is nice. And then I was thinking of some other stuff. I was like, wait, are those native? More recently, I've been getting into bee balm. I've been liking, we've been putting them in a number of our bioinfiltration basins, some of our retrofits. And they are just such cool looking flowers, and they smell great. Monarda didyma. That's one of the scarlet bee balm is one of the ones I think I ended up incorporating into my yard, and it's a pollinator. It's pollinator habitat, and so it's I really have taken to that recently, and so that would be my go-to.
That's a great plant,
my favorite
and it's a little bit more deer resistant. I believe that's in the mint family, so it's which would explain the fragrance. But the flower on that, now that you say it does kind of look something that could be prehistoric, like the flower.
It's like a firework.
Yeah, totally. It's a little bit different. It gives you that different feel. I I say to Tom all the time, he doesn't see it, but that plant smells. The scent of that plant reminds me of Fruit Loops cereal. I don't know.
I can kind of see that. I typically liken it to some kind of soap,
Oh,
but
you know what? Nah,
I can see. I think maybe it depends on the species, or if you have a certain cultivar or something.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, the ones that I have are particularly like a nice soap, not the weird,
Yeah.
overly grandma's powder room soap. It's a nice nice mellow, but still kind of botanical,
Nice.
if you will.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I tend to like flowers that are not your standard petals. I don't like that. I like orchids too. Those are cool.
Well, I don't think that anyone had said bee balm before. Like we have to create a list, but
Well,
in 80
update on that is we are creating a list.
Oh,
It's
okay.
in the works.
There you go.
I didn't
And,
think that would happen. I really
Yeah,
didn't.
no. My wife's creating the list. She's
Okay.
listening to every episode to pick everyone's favorite plant, and it's going to be organized by who picked it, what episode number, and how many.
Put me down for Scarlet Bee Balm.
Yeah.
I don't think there's much overlap. There's
No, there really
probably
hasn't been.
like in 80. This is episode 82.
Yep.
Like maybe there's only been like 2 or 3 overlap. I'm gonna
Oh,
guess,
wow.
which is pretty surprising. Well, I
Lot
guess
of-
not if
lot
you
of
think of how
places
many
to choose
native
from, yeah.
plants there are.
Well,
So we do end the show with we all take a turn with a final thought, and we hand it over to you first, and that time can be used. You can summarize, you can plug something, you can mention something maybe that you hadn't thought of, but we kind of turn the floor over to you and let you take a couple minutes to say whatever you want to say.
oh, well, thank you. It's what. First of all, I will thank you. I appreciate you thinking of us. I'm glad to know that Princeton Hydro is as pervasive in this kind of field as it is. Even surprise, it's Princeton Hydro. Through the engineering, the design, the uplift, the green infrastructure is certainly something we're moving to. Really, we always have advocated for green infrastructure. So thank you for helping us to kind of promote that message and thinking about what does that do for the habitat. The parts, the many parts of the bigger system that we want to try to always keep in our minds, the watershed, and kind of improving our environment, but also our community for the better. It's not just about being green and hugging a tree, or a fish or whatever. It's about trying to make life better for everyone, not just the plants and the fish and the water and the air, but also us too. Humans have a huge impact on the environment, but we want to be able to work in harmony with our surroundings. And that's kind of what my final thought, I guess.
And that's probably the hardest part. And that's a great,
Yeah.
great final thought as well.
For real.
You want
Like
to
I
go?
said,
Or you want me to
mine
go?
is a bit of a question,
Okay.
and we've talked about floating islands. I'm sure people are going to be really interested in floating islands. Where are some places people can see floating islands? At least in our area.
That's a great.
I mentioned
great question,
Baltimore
Tom.
Inner Harbor, right
Oh,
around the
yeah.
National Aquarium. There's some there. I
Sure.
know, what's it in Philadelphia on?
Oh, the Maritime Museum.
Yes, yeah.
They
Oh, yeah.
worked with them a few years ago. You actually went, didn't you?
Yeah,
For the,
yeah.
the
I went for
groundbreaking?
the grand opening, or maybe they're just doing the planting then. But I was there, and the news was there, and I had done absolutely nothing other than show up with a flat of plants, and they wanted to take my picture. But yeah, so that was cool. I'm trying to think of some of the other places, but
So
I was
the
wondering if
Watershed
you knew other
Institute?
places. Yeah.
Watershed Institute, I think they may have helped over at Rosedale Lake. So there's a number of them in Mercer County. I'll be honest, I can't remember exactly. I feel like I should know that one. I read something about it not that long ago. Ours are in Asbury Park. We've got a handful. I want to say there's 6 in Sunset Lake, and on the west side of Sunset Lake near the outlet to Deal. There are 6 in Wesley Lake on the eastern side of the Heck Street Pilgrim Pathway Bridge. I mean, Wesley Lake is pretty open, so it's not like you're going to miss them if you go east towards the ocean. We have, I think, 5 of them up in Belcher Creek up in West Milford, New Jersey. So way up there. If any of you are in North Jersey, I think I'm trying to think how best to see those. Those you might have to get into Belcher Creek on a boat, kayak, something like that. There's access is tricky. Maybe Camp Hope. I'm not sure how available that is to get into either. So those are the ones that I've installed. We have a number in the Poconos that are in Harvey's. I think Harvey's Lake has some. The Hideout has some. That might actually be one of our oldest installations.
Okay.
There's that's a private lake, sort of. There's not a whole lot of access to that. I want to say in Southampton, New York. We have a couple. You know what? I want to say there's a couple in Fort Pond in Montauk. We didn't do those, but a friend of mine is part of an organization that recently installed floating islands.
I'm trying to remember who it was, if it was the Northport Native Plant Initiative or one of the initiatives up in Long Island just got plants from us this spring for floating.
Okay, it could be. I think Concerned Citizens of Montauk was the group
that's what it was. Yeah.
That's that. Yeah. Yeah. Good friends of mine is one on the, I believe she's she's on the executive board. We taught a coral reef ecology course in St. John.
Oh, wow.
Fancy. Yeah. That was, oh man, talk about plants. Man, the mangroves there were amazing. The roots going up and whatnot.
Yeah.
Oh man, we could spend another hour on that.
There's places you can see these. If you're in our area, that there's a couple that we just listed off. If you're not, we're gonna put up. I gotta find that video from the National Aquarium has, where they show the underneath and everything, and we'll put that on our show notes. But
we've done it also before. Maybe in the Facebook group, we can start a post and everyone can say, like, if you're in different parts of the country where there's a floating island that people can go see. So just reference the Facebook group. You no longer have to join. You can just view. It's the Native Plants Healthy Planet Facebook group. And we'll put some stuff in the show notes as well. I guess I get a final thought too.
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah, your turn.
Yeah. I don't have much one other than when we first started the podcast, I thought at some point we would run out of ideas of where to go with or what to talk about. And it's, had we stuck with native plants, maybe we would have, but it really turned more into ecology. And I think our latest pattern is talking about green infrastructure, and it's important. And we always discuss what we've lost or what we're losing, but it's great to focus on what you can reclaim as well. So this is something we've talked about, big projects, but if you have a water source in your back or on your property, like this is something that maybe would work for you. We have a small pond here. We have a floating island. I know at our municipal building, maybe something if you're involved in local politics, this is something you get done to help. And it's just another way of looking at how you can help, another way that you can help water quality, help the food web, help habitat for everyone. So keep thinking outside the box. And these are technologies. I'm sure I'd love to come back and revisit this 5 years from now just to see what we've learned from the floating islands, that now that you have a history and some of these become 10, 15, 20 years old, like where are we at with methane intake and things like that? Just, you need these so you can build the science to continue to evolve and get better at it and figure out, I can't wait to learn what we're going to learn from this, what we don't know yet. So
yeah. I wonder how we can augment it to improve refugia for juvenile fish, and if that helps a fishery at all, or totally.
Yeah, completely excited. So and let's see where that takes us.
So that is it. Thank you for joining us today. We hope you enjoy listening. Oh gosh, I got your last name again.
Come on, Tom, you can do it.
Jack Szczepanski.
I'll take it.
Okay.
Szczepanski.
Yeah, that'll work.
Szczepanski.
Szczepanski. Yeah.
So, from Princeton Hydro. For more information, visit www.princetonhydro.com. Thank you, everyone, for listening to Native Plants, Healthy Planet, presented by Pinelands Nursery.
We're going to give a big thank you to the Egocentric Plastic Man for contributing theme music to the Meet Our Guest podcast. We actually, our next Rooted discussion will have new theme music. So we did have someone submit music for that, and we're going to have new Rooted discussion music at the beginning of the year. So, and so if you're interested in Egocentric Plastic Man, you can stream or buy their music wherever you consume or stream your music. And if you want to see them live music's back. So they perform a lot in the Manayunk area of Philadelphia. So look them up. You can follow us if you want to follow us on Twitter at Pineland Nursery, Facebook at Pinelands Nursery NJ, Instagram at Pinelands Nursery or Native Plants _Healthy Planet, and YouTube at Pinelands Nursery. We haven't had a lot of action on the question and comment line, but I just want to remind you, we have that. It's 215-346-6189. I will repeat that, 215-346-6189. When you call and ask a question or leave a comment, we'll play it on a future episode of The Buzz, and we'll answer it. And if we can't answer it, we'll phone a friend, phone an expert. And the Native Plants Healthy Planet Facebook group, we're over 800 members at this point, and the conversations have been fantastic. So make sure you go. You can vote on this or that for the last episode of The Buzz, or just follow along with some of our conversations, and we'll keep it going there.
Yeah. So you can listen to Native Plants Healthy Planet podcast directly at www.nativeplantshealthyplanet.com. If you go to our website, there's also a link that you can buy t-shirts that are all native plant themed, and go to support a lot of these organizations that we're having on the podcast to help them with the work that they're doing. So we aren't making a dime off of it. It's all going to them. But if you're listening and you're listening on Apple Podcasts, do us a favor, leave a 5-star review. If you write something, I'll give you a shout out, but that goes a long, long way in helping us. And if you can, wherever you're listening, Podbean, Spotify, Stitcher, really wherever you're consuming your podcast, you should be able to listen to us there. So with that, thank you, everyone. I'm Tom.
And I am Fran. Thank you again, everyone. Jack, thank you again on such short notice and giving us so much of your time and putting up with all of our questions today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. This was fantastic. Thank you.
Awesome. So we have a Buzz episode coming up next week. So keep tuned for that. So they're always fun. And just make sure you tune in, and we'll see everyone next time. Until then, keep it native.